Liberia. Between 1980 and 1990, America's strongest ally in Africa was Samuel Kenyon Doe of Liberia. Samuel Kenyon Doe came to power in Liberia in 1980, and his rule lasted for 10 years until his overthrow in 1990. First, he was a military ruler from 1980 to 1985, and as a civilian from 1985 to 1990. His rule was a scene of the worst human rights violations in Africa in the 1980s. To understand the rise of Samuel Kenyon Doe, we need to look at the history of Liberia first. Liberia is a country found in western part of Africa, founded by the American Colonization Society as a home for freed and freeborn slaves from America. You see, slaveholders in America had concerns about the growing number of freed slaves and their descendants that had steadily grown, which created concerns about the free blacks' ability to aid the escape of slaves or to form a slave rebellion. So in order to address these concerns, they had to repatriate a big chunk of freed slaves from America to Africa, and the place they chose was Liberia. Between 1820 to 1843, 4,571 freed slaves were dispatched from America to Liberia. The new immigrants were known as the Americo-Liberians, to differentiate them from the indigenous people or tribes that had inhabited Liberia for centuries. In 1847, the American Colonization Society encouraged Liberia to declare independence to cut down the cost of running the colony by the American government. With the settlements set up, Americo-Liberians retained most of their American heritage in architecture, dressing. They also adopted the single star and stripes flag to represent their country. They named the capital Monrovia after the 5th President of the United States of America, James Monroe. For more than 100 years, from 1877 to 1980, Liberia was governed under a one-party rule by a party known as the True Whig Party, which monopolized power, a record no other party in the world has ever equaled. The Americo-Liberians saw the indigenous people as backward and only fit for exploitation, and as a matter of fact, they subjugated them, discriminated them, and rigidly controlled them. In 1931, a report by the League of Nations implicated senior government officials in the involvement with organized slavery that forced the then Liberian president to resign. The Liberians were looking for a savior to free them from all this suffering, and the opportunity presented itself in the early 1980s. On April 12, 1980, a 20-year-old Master Sergeant Samuel Kenyon Doe and a group of 17 dissident officers attacked the executive mansion, the then president's residence. His death was brutal, where he was shot 3 times in the head, eyes gouged out and dismembered. His remains were hauled off in a mass grave with 27 others who died defending the palace at the time. The son of the then president, Ebit Holbert, also met a similar fate, and thus that marked the end of the 133-year rule of Americo-Liberians and the True Whig Party. The days that followed, ministers and high-ranking officials were also rounded up, made to walk nude around the capital, and then executed publicly by firing squad at Monrovia Beach amid jubilations from the public. Having taken power at 28 years old, Master Sergeant Samuel Kenyon Doe was the youngest and the lowest-ranking officer to take power in Africa. Just like many cool leaders in Africa at the time, he made grand promises about eradication of corruption, oppression, and fight against economic inequality and restoring the country to civilian rule. However, in no time, he suspended the constitution, promoted himself to general, and established the People's Redemption Council, composed of 17 coup-makers, of which he chaired. The executive and legislative branches of the government were dissolved, banned all political activity, and declared martial law. He released 50 opposition leaders and arrested 91 from Robert's government. With no constitution, Doe ruled by decree for 5 years. Trials were conducted by the PRC, with defendants being refused legal representation, ensuring their instant conviction. The Kran tribe from which he belonged enjoyed promotions at the expense of other tribes. They were given key positions in the military, security, and the elite military unit. Their major role was to suppress dissidents that provoked tribal animosities that laid ground for a catastrophic civil war later. Doe's presidency is famously renowned for his strong alignment with the United States of America. He was America's strongest ally in Africa, and his support was rewarded with massive foreign assistance from Ronald Reagan's administration. As a Cold War ally, he served Americans by protecting the US facilities, interests, and investments, which included a naval base in Monrovia, which was built during the Second World War, a transmission station for Voice of America that broadcasted throughout Africa, and the Omega navigation system used in shipping up and down the Atlantic. The US Embassy in Liberia also acted as a major transfer point for intelligence gathering in Africa. To effectively fight communism throughout Africa, Sergeant Doe granted America access to all Liberian ports to deploy a force and security installations. When Sergeant Doe took power in 1980, Cuba was one of the first countries to recognize the change of government in Liberia. However, Sergeant Doe and his PRC governing body distanced itself from Cuba and all American enemies like Libya. In May 1981, he closed the Libyan embassy in Monrovia and reduced the Soviet staff at the embassy in July 1985. The government went out of its way to sack all school teachers with alleged socialist sympathies and vowed to hold schools and universities responsible for harboring individuals who attempted to teach socialism in whatever form. He re-established diplomatic relations with Israel and visited Jerusalem in September 1983 in defiance of OAU boycott in order to please the United States of America. On 17 August 1982, Sergeant Doe was rewarded with a state visit to the White House, during which Ronald Reagan famously referred to him as Chairman Doe. They also met again in 1983 after the UN General Assembly and described him as a dependable ally. For his role to thwart the regional ambitions of Washington, Doe was granted special protection by the CIA. By 1984, Washington was assisting in payment of teachers' salaries and also provided rice to Liberia to prevent the repetition of the rice riots that had proved fatal for the former president, Tolbert. Between 1980 and 1985, Samuel Doe received $500 million in aid and loans, making Liberia the highest recipient of American aid in sub-Saharan Africa. However, most of this aid was mismanaged and spent on self-enrichment, from acquiring 2 private jets, 2 mansions in Liberia, real estates in New Jersey, California, Florida, Brussels, and fat overseas bank accounts. He used part of the funds to also install a satellite dish on his mansion so he could watch speeches by Ronald Reagan, whom he professed to admire. It is estimated that Samuel Doe and his associates embezzled over $300 million during the 1980s. Doe himself is said to have stashed away $5.6 million in an overseas bank account. In 1984, under intense pressure from the US, Doe was convinced to hold elections and lift a ban on political activity. Despite promises to retire and return power to civilian rule, he announced his intent to stand in the 1985 elections. He is also alleged to have changed his official birthday from 1951 to 1950 in order to meet the new constitutional requirements that required the presidential candidate to be at least 35. In his campaign for presidency, he smashed the opposition at every chance, banned 2 of the most popular candidates, citing they advocated socialism. He imprisoned key oppositional leaders like Amos Sawyer and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, a Harvard-trained economist, which prompted the Reagan administration to suspend $25 million worth of aid. Upon release, Doe collected the $25 million and went on to rig the election. He had ballots taken away to a secret location, and 50 of his own illegally picked staff counted them, declaring him a winner with 51% of the vote, which was enough to avoid a runoff. On January 6, 1986, he was sworn in as the president of Liberia. However, a month later, his former partner and nemesis, Thomas Kowinkpa attempted to overthrow him. He seized the army barracks, the government radio station, and broadcasted a message promising free and fair elections. However, Doe regained control with the help of the military and the executive mansion guards that consisted mainly of soldiers from the Crown tribe. With the failure of the coup, Kowinkpa was arrested outside Monrovia, killed, and his body taken to a market where he was castrated, dismembered, and parts of his body eaten. Hundreds from Kowinkpa's tribe, the Giyo and the Mano, from Nimba County, were executed, and civilians who openly celebrated prematurely were dragged from their homes, executed, and buried in massive graves. Despite all this brutality, the United States under the Reagan administration continued to support Samuel Doe and his government, claiming he was someone they had to live with. Doe's government faced a lot of financial troubles that eventually led to his unpopularity and eventual downfall. In 1986, he was denied defaulting rights of $900 million by the International Monetary Fund, which forced him to reduce all government jobs and salaries. The same year, the World Bank stopped all loans. By 1987, the Reagan administration was embroiled in the Iran-Contra scandal. The Cold War was coming to an end, and military assistance to sub-Saharan Africa was sharply chopped from $147.6 million in 1985 to $25.5 million in 1988. With a decrease in the US financial support, Sergeant Doe turned to countries like Israel, Romania, South Korea, and Nigeria. In 1988, the country was put under international receivership. When the United States of America sent financial experts to come and oversee government spending, Doe scuttled the agreement within months. The following year, in May 1989, military assistance was finally cut by the Americans. Sergeant Doe had outlived his strategic usefulness to Washington. Bereft of US support, he was left vulnerable to new predators. First, it was Charles Taylor, a former minister in Doe's government, who was fired for embezzlement of $900,000 in 1983. He fled to the United States of America, where he was detained and later escaped from prison in 1985. He found allies in Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Cameroon, who supported him in launching the National Patriotic Front of Liberia. The other was a splinter group from Charles Taylor, led by Prince Johnson, who broke away due to an internal dispute. He formed the International Patriotic Front of Liberia and captured Monrovia by the late summer of 1990. Despite interventions for peace by West African states through Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group, ECOMOG, the war revved on. As the US and European citizens were being evacuated from Monrovia, Sergeant Doe's days were numbered. So he tried out a last-ditch effort to ask help from the Americans under the George Bush administration. By so, he published an article in the Washington Post in August 1990. In the article, he said, "Our capital is named after your President Monroe. Our flag is a replica of your flag. Our laws are patterned after your laws. We in Liberia have always considered ourselves stepchildren of the United States. We implore you to come and help your stepchildren who are in danger of losing their freedoms and lives." On September 9, 1990, Doe was captured while on a visit to ECOMOG headquarters by Prince Johnson's forces. He was stripped to his underpants, tortured, and brutally beaten. He was later taken to a compound where he was told to repeat after the interrogator that I, Samuel Kenyon Doe, declare that the government is overthrown, and am therefore asking the armed forces to surrender to Field Marshal Prince Johnson. His body was mutilated the following day and paraded through the streets of Monrovia. Having spilled so much blood and made so many enemies in his rise to the top, a bloody end seemed like a predictable outcome for Samuel Doe. Though Samuel Doe was deposed, that did not end the problems of Liberia. However, it marked the beginning of a civil war that lasted for 13 years, from 1989 to 2003, in one of Africa's longest civil war that left 250,000 people dead. Thank you for listening.